32. The black skyscraper towered above him in all its hideousness, reaching toward the filthy smog, as in the streets a myriad of cars filled the air with hateful honking. His need to escape became paramount, and thus he rushed from this modern activity toward the old and neglected portion of town, a place that was shunned by most because of its dilapidation, its stench of decay that came, in part, from the place at the bottom of one steep hill, where a charnel canal dragged its water through a realm that was always dark with mist and shadow. He tripped down the hill, past vacant buildings with shattered windows, over pavement littered with grime and shards of broken glass. Slowing his pace, he listened to the silence of the place, which was another reason why the city's mundane inhabitants did not like it. For they found a kind of safety in their clamour, whereas quiet was a thing they could not comprehend, a thing that drove them to distraction. Even the dark water of the lean canal refused to make a noise, and he gazed into its current as he gradually stepped onto the ancient stone of the bridge that crossed the water. Stopping for one moment to study the sluggish flow of water, he saw a pale thing rise to the surface and bump against one side of the stone wall of the canal, and he thought perhaps the malformed thing might once have been human, although he could not be certain as the current caught it and pulled it from his view. He continued his walk along the other length of old stone, and followed the gaunt road that took him to St. Toad's. The pile of stone, black with age, rose within its shroud of fog, a miasma that smelled far sweeter than the foulness belched within the artificial city. He pressed his hand against the squares of rock with which the edifice had been constructed, and knew that this stone had not been some false manufacture of mankind. It was an element of earth, cold and real. In calm reverence, he entered St. Toad's, and found the statue that awaited him in a place of soft illumination, the chiselled form that wore a pallid mask. She had been expertly composed, and as he kissed one chilly breast, he could almost imagine that a pulse reverberated from some place beneath it. Lowering to humble knees, he studied the symbol that had been etched onto her firm palm, a sign that drank the room's pale light and was reflected on his eyes. Shutting those eyes, he tilted to the palm and licked it. He shuddered as the place grew chilly, yet when he went to embrace himself, he could not find his mortal frame. He had escaped his hunk of solid flesh. Now he wandered through a dimension of dreaming the likes of which he had never experienced. He drifted into a darksome valley, and its depth of haunted woodland, beside a foul lake, in which suggestive black shapes splashed awfully. The surrounding trees were spotted with unwholesome fungi and phosphorescent patches of moss. Pausing behind the lake, he peered into its squalid depths, through which a viscous creature broke, a nebulous thing that wore his face and whistled like a fiend before submerging once again into the undulating perdition. He rose and watched the illuminated woodland for any sign of movement, but there was none, and yet a presence from the place beckoned and beguiled him, and so he moved into its lonesome places, until coming to one tree from which small orbs dangled from low boughs, cloudy globes of crystal with hints of fire at their centres. He saw that these globes were not perfectly round, rather they had oblate ends, which brought to mind a passage that he had scanned in a yellow parchment manuscript of the Book of Ibon, which told of a wizard who had owned such a spherical crystal in which he could behold some secrets beyond the rim of sanity. Reaching up to touch one low crystal, he peered at the pinprick of light at its centre, and saw it blossom into a dream within a dream. He watched, bewitched, the thing that pushed out of earth before him, the gaunt tower of black stone that was octagonal in shape and some 16 feet in height. Creeping to it, his attention was caught by the characters etched upon its surface, and he lifted his hands so that they moved over those markings as a blind man's might decipher braille. And as his hands smoothed the stone, his palms transformed, splitting open as mouths that mewed the language etched on stone. The sound of those syllables made him giddy, so that he bent backward and fell on to the place where there should have been ground. But all he could feel was a continuation of plummeting, as the black obelisk melted into a mound of loathsome sentience, a formless mass of slime and poisonous vapours. To look upon this unfathomable horror was to surrender all sanity and every ounce of remaining humanity. Thus he bubbled as a blind amorphous stream of slime that spilled into the swamp of nothingness, where he splashed among his kindred in a mire of meaningless cosmic mud. 33. It wafted to him from the distant harbour, the low and bestial whistling that overwhelmed with desolation. Exiting the café, he stumbled beneath the old roofs that tilted toward the street, past the shuttered windows of strangely tenanted hovels, composed of crumbling brick and rotted wood. He paused for one moment before the cloudy window of an antique shop, and pressed his face against the cold, unyielding glass. And as he peered into the spectral room of forgotten things, he thought he could espy a dim silhouette that motioned to him invitingly. Gazing through the dusky glass had always bequeathed a sense of dreaming, as if the place before him were a realm of vision that could melt his solid flesh and pull him into another place, and he would have allowed himself such alteration, if the harbour whistles had not sounded a second time, and lured him from the glass and down the lane, past the decaying spire of an abandoned funerary chapel, along the twisting cobblestone lanes, on which crumbling warehouses slept within their shrouds of mist and spray. He slipped onto a wooden pier, and leaned on its railings as he peered at the expanse of feculent water, trying not to gag at the fumes that coiled from the floating debris among the carcasses of fowl and fish. One piece of litter strangely caught the reflection of the yellow moon, and as he studied it he thought it was some portion of a leather sail to which had been fastened a pallid mask. He looked at it as the moonlight dimmed, imagining that the flat fabric floating on still water began to ripple, to rise slowly and whistle to him. It shaped itself into a naked human form that walked on water toward the pier, so malignant that he had to shut his eyes and clamp hands over his ears. He could not, however, block the stench that rose from the water and settled just before him. Wet hands pressed against his wide forehead, and played within his scant hair, as something kissed his rector's collar and moaned his name. Raising his hands to push the thing away, he touched the heavy breasts that swung before him, as something chilly found his ear and whistled once again. He opened his eyes and beheld the naked thing that wore a pallid mask. Beneath that facade of silk a voice, low and mesmerizing, sighed to him to join with her as she danced upon the water. "Come with me," it coaxed, "and I will plunge thee into a depth of dreaming such as you have never known." He saw the long steel needles that kept the mask in place, and he watched a lithe black hand pinch that needle that had been pushed through the mask's mouth, and pulled it free. How wickedly the moonlight shimmered on the needle's point, and how cold that needle was as the figure smoothed it across his lips. He watched the hand that removed the other implements that fastened mask to flesh, and when the last needle was removed he raised his hands so as to catch the mask that fell to them. He did not understand why there was no face before him at the place from which the mask had fallen, why there was nothing but smooth black surface that seemed to drink an essence of glimmering moonlight, and thus glisten like a pool of oil. God, how silky was the mask against his fingers! What wonderful fragrance wafted from it, sweet yet pungent, like shards of odour that pierced into his brain. Perhaps, if he pressed the mask to his face, it would dispel the wretched harbour stench that made him want to vomit. He pushed the perfumed silk to his face, and peeped through eye-holes as the black woman's hands drifted to him, and began to push the needles that she held through the silken fabric. He uttered no sound as the final pin found his mouth again, and pushed through his numbing lips. His eyes remained open, as the figure tilted to him and pressed her facelessness against the mask, as the wooden pier melted beneath his feet. He thought he could see vaguely through the shadow that engulfed him, see the water on which he danced with his spectral mistress in his arms, the enchantress who kept her promise and dragged him downward into a realm of immortal nightmare.